Now, moving on from the inflation numbers, a group of private and public sector players have come together to launch the Alliance for Affordable Internet. This is a coalition to lead policy and regulatory reform and to spur action to drive down artificially high internet prices in developing countries. For more, I'm joined in studio now by Ori Akola, Director at Investments at Omidyar Network. Ori, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Now, talk to us about who are your partners in the alliance and precisely what is the alliance setting itself out to do?
Thank you very much for having me. So the alliance is quite broad. We have over 30 partners and are looking to grow that base significantly now that we've launched. It includes companies like Ericsson, Facebook, Intel, Yahoo, some policy partners as well, Research ICT Africa, civil society members like the Association for Progressive Communications. Basically, it's three broad sectors: private sector, civil society, government, and advocacy groups. And the idea is to get the next 1 to 2 billion citizens online.
Now, let's look at a little bit around the broader policy issues. I understand that there's a UN Broadband Commission that has set specific targets that developing countries should be aspiring to. Talk us through what those targets are and how far we as developing nations in reaching those targets.
So one of the key targets, for instance, is that the monthly cost of internet access should be capped at about 5% of the monthly income. If you've seen what's been happening over the last few years is that internet access is growing, particularly in the developing world, primarily through mobile access. But the costs are still very high, and there's issues around quality as well. The other goal is to bring penetration, particularly in Africa, which is sitting at an average of 16%, to double that, so that we're not lagging too far behind other regions like Asia and the Pacific, which are averaging at about 30% now.
Ori, what is the strategy? It sounds like a bold initiative to bring down broadband costs, and we're looking at about 90% of the 1.1 billion households that are not connected to the internet. How are you planning to go about this?
So there are a number of ways. One is to standard set. And say if you showcase countries, particularly on the policy front, that have taken the right steps. I think Kenya is one of them that is looked at as a model, and there's a reason why the former permanent secretary of ICT in Kenya is our chair, and saying, you know, you can do all you want on the technology side, you can have the latest design, the cables have landed, but the blocks are still really now remaining on the policy and the regulatory front, and saying, one, what are the standards that we can look at? Who can we emulate? Two, on areas where we need to advocate and push a little bit. For instance, tax on mobile phones is something we feel is a luxury tax for a device that's such a primary means of communication. And the third is to work with companies on the technology front to see how can they drive internet access through their products, whether it's better devices, more affordable devices, and so on.
To a large extent, I mean, this conversation around broadband, there's been a lot of buzz around the concept of white space and tapping into the white space. Does this form part of your strategy in any way?
Absolutely. It's one of the many things that we're looking at. In my previous role at Google, I actually drove the white space initiatives that was launched in South Africa. Other companies like Microsoft are quite active in the region. And why it's particularly interesting is the amount of available spectrum in the region for TV white spaces. Normally, regulators look at spectrum as something that's rare and that they need to protect and auction to the highest bidder. And what we're saying, if you combine the availability of things like TV white spaces with the fact that many regulators, not just in Africa, but in other developing countries, do not use their broadband, for instance, the universal service funds, can they be deployed to technologies like TV white spaces to reach underserviced areas? So saying, for instance, that it might not be practical for an MTN to build its network everywhere because they're a company profit-making, that they need to, recoup their investments. But in the case where a resource like TV white spaces is available anywhere, can connect people who are very remote, how can they be reached, and how can government facilitate that?
Ori, what are your targets? How many countries are you hoping to target, and how many countries do you want to reach, and by when?
So our initial target for 2013 is to launch with 3 to 4 countries where there'll be targeted activities. Also, by the end of the year, we'll be launching something called an Affordability Report. Because one of the things we found is, if you take South Africa as an example, trying to find out what's the most affordable prepaid data package is so confusing. Right. So what is the cost of access? And that will be covering, I think, about 54 countries. And we hope to reach in the next 3 years of about 12 to 15 countries.
Very quickly, can you divulge your 3 to 4 countries that are at the top of your radar?
No, it's still a work in progress. I mean, we're sort of assessing which governments will be the best people to work with, where we can leverage the most. But I'd say it's probably 2 of the 3 would be in Africa and the other 2 probably in Asia.
And very quickly again, before I let you go, you've spoken about the Affordability Report. How are you going to position this report so that it's not seen as just another document and that it's really integrated into policy? I think
that's a great question. One is just really digging down and saying, this relative to other countries, this is how much the internet costs. If you're a consumer, this is where you're positioned and this is where you should be getting to. And I think if you look at other indices that have come up in the last few years, for instance, the Doing Business report in Africa that the World Bank drives, you see a lot of countries now competing to move up the rankings or getting worried when their rankings move down. We hope to position the Affordability Report in the same way, where countries consider this something of pride to show that they're becoming more affordable and something of a concern if they're less affordable.